Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a child, just a few years old, who starts talking about having lived another life before this one.
Hmm.
Not just, fleeting imaginary play, but specific, verifiable details about a real person who lived and died maybe years before the child was even born.
Yeah.
And here's the twist. What if that child was born with a physical mark, a birthmark, or even a birth defect? That seems to correspond precisely to a wound or injury that person suffered.
That's really the hook, isn't it?
Mm.
That's the starting point for some of the most, well, fascinating and sometimes really challenging research into consciousness and identity that we're diving into today.
Right?
We're exploring the extensive work of the late Dr. Ian Stevenson and his colleagues, who systematically investigated hundreds of these cases across the globe.
Right. Our mission in this deep dive is to really get into the source material you've shared with us. We're going to pull out the key insights, focusing specifically on the physical evidence that Stevenson documented these birthmarks and birth defects.
Yeah, the tangible stuff.
Exactly. We want to understand what the sources say about these truly unusual occurrences, looking closely at the scientific details presented and trying to make them as clear and understandable as possible.
And keeping it objective, like the research itself tried to be.
Absolutely. Maintaining that objective approach found in the research itself.
Precisely. The goal is to understand the methodology, the data they collected, and particularly how they documented the physically observable evidence, which, is often seen as the most compelling aspect of these cases.
So where does research like this even happen? I mean, are these just isolated anecdotes from one place, or is this a phenomenon reported more widely?
Well, according to the sources, these cases have popped up in many different cultures around the world. They are found frequently in places where belief in reincarnation is pretty strong,
Like where specifically?
like many countries in South Asia, India, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar, places like that. Also among certain groups like the Shiite peoples of Lebanon and Turkey. And, interestingly, some tribal groups in West Africa and the northwestern parts of North America.
Okay, so it's not limited to just one cultural context then. But the sources also mention cases appearing in Europe and other regions where reincarnation isn't really a dominant cultural belief.
That's correct. It's not exclusively tied to cultures with strong reincarnation beliefs. Although, as the sources point out, having that belief might make families and communities more receptive.
More willing to report it, maybe, or take it seriously.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It potentially creates a kind of cultural framework for understanding and discussing a child's unusual statements. Makes it less weird, perhaps.
Right. And the scale of this investigation, the sources talk about hundreds of documented cases. That's a significant body of work.
It really is. Stevenson's larger multi-volume work presents detailed reports on 225 cases. The abridged version we're drawing heavily from provides summaries of 112 of those. So it's not just a handful. It's a substantial collection built up over many decades. And the argument is that this large sample size lets researchers spot patterns, common features across cases.
Which lends weight to observations that might seem like just random weirdness if you only saw one or two cases.
Precisely. Having a large data set like that allows for, well, more rigorous analysis.
Okay. So tell us about the methodology. How did Stevenson and his colleagues actually investigate these claims according to the sources? What was their process?
The core method, as described in the sources, was really rigorous field investigation. It centered around extensive interviews.
Talking with people.
Lots of talking. They'd interview the child subject, naturally, and their current family members, parents, grandparents, siblings, sometimes neighbors or others who heard the child's statements early on.
Okay.
Then, if the child's statements were detailed enough to suggest a specific deceased person, they call this the previous personality,
Right.
they would then attempt to locate and interview the family of that deceased person.
So it's a process of trying to match the child's often spontaneous statements to the life history of a real person who has died.
Exactly. A case is considered solved if they can identify a previous personality whose life details match up. And crucially, those details need to be verified by independent sources if possible.
Like what kind of sources?
Well, ideally, things like the previous family's testimony, public records, maybe medical reports, things that align with the child's statements and behaviors. Cases where no such match is found are documented as unsolved, and they're obviously much harder to interpret in this framework.
And the sources acknowledge they often worked with local associates and interpreters. That must add layers of complexity, right? Linguistic, cultural.
Oh, absolutely. They're quite transparent about those challenges.
Yeah.
Language barriers, cultural nuances, making sure the interpreter isn't subtly influencing the interviews. These are all potential issues.
So how did they try to ensure accuracy there?
Well, the sources highlight the measures they took. They often worked with long-term associates and interpreters, some who collaborated with Stevenson for like a decade or more.
So they got really experienced.
Very experienced in this specific type of inquiry. And these individuals weren't just, translating word for word. They'd suggest additional questions based on their cultural understanding or maybe patterns they'd seen in prior cases. They became active partners, really.
Ah, okay.
And they also frequently recorded interviews. That allowed them to check translations later if needed. The emphasis was definitely on meticulous documentation of everything that was said.
Okay, so careful recording and experienced local help. What about the crucial step of verifying the child's claims? How did they try to rule out the possibility that the child or their family had somehow acquired information about the deceased person through, normal means, like hearing gossip or reading something?
Yeah, this is a critical part of their method, and the sources really highlight it. They made significant efforts, whenever possible, to verify the child's statements before arranging any meeting between the child's current family and the previous personality's family.
Ah, to keep them separate initially.
Exactly. The idea was to gather as much verifiable information from the previous personality side based only on what the child had said before the two families ever interacted.
I see. To minimize that potential information leakage or, people unconsciously shaping their memories once they meet?
Precisely. They document details. The child stated, I lived in this village, I died this way, I owned this thing, and then go to the previous family or check records to see if those specific details were accurate.
But even with those precautions, the sources acknowledge that they are relying on human memory, which we all know is fallible. People forget things, they might misremember details, mix things up.
That's a key point the sources are definitely upfront about. Informants' memories aren't perfect, and it can be difficult, sometimes maybe impossible, to definitively trace the original source of every single piece of information.
Right.
However, they also discuss analyses they conducted. These suggested that while minor details might occasionally be mixed up, like left-right confusion regarding a scar or something, informant memories were often correct on the essential features of the previous personality's life, the core stuff.
And wasn't there something about comparing testimony to medical records?
Yes, exactly. This is pretty compelling. In 49 cases where they could compare informant testimony about a specific physical detail, like the location or nature of a wound, to an actual medical document.
Like an autopsy report or hospital record?
Yes, exactly that kind of thing. The postmortem report, hospital notes. In those 49 cases, the informant's descriptions were found to be correct in 88% of instances.
88% accuracy when cross-referenced with a medical record. That's a pretty high batting average for human memory, especially recalling details about someone else's life and death, possibly from years ago.
It suggests that while, fallibility exists, the core factual basis of the information being reported in these cases wasn't just fabricated or wildly inaccurate, at least not in the majority of instances where that kind of hard, independent verification was possible.
Okay, that gives us a good understanding of the investigative approach. Now, let's zero in on what the sources present as arguably the most objective and, physically grounded type of evidence in these cases, the birthmarks and birth defects.
Yes.
This is where the physical body of the child seems to carry a literal imprint, maybe, of the previous life.
This is indeed a central focus of Stevenson's work, and the sources spend considerable time detailing this type of evidence. It's considered important for a few key reasons.
Okay.
Firstly, it's physically observable. It's not just an internal memory or a spoken statement. You can actually see the mark or the defect.
You can point to it.
You can point to it. You can document it with photographs, sketches, take measurements. It's something tangible.
Right. Objective in that sense.
Exactly. And secondly, and perhaps most critically in many cases, they were able to obtain medical documents pertaining to the deceased person.
We just talked about those.
Right. The postmortem reports, autopsy protocols, hospital records detailing injuries or maybe surgical procedures. These documents could sometimes provide independent, contemporary confirmation of a wound or a scar or some other mark on the deceased person's body.
That corresponded in location and appearance to the birthmark or defect on the child.
Precisely. Location, size, shape, appearance. The correspondence could be quite specific.
So having medical documentation to back up the physical correspondence on the child, that adds a whole new level of verification beyond just family testimony, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
It shifts the evidence, at least in those cases, from being solely reliant on human memory and testimony, however well corroborated that might be, to having a physical correlation potentially supported by a medical record created around the time of the previous personality's death.
Okay, let's get into the specifics then. What kinds of physical correspondences did they document, according to the sources? Maybe start with just general birthmarks.
Sure. So the sources note that some of the birthmarks found on these children are, well, pretty much indistinguishable from ordinary nevus, moles that anyone might have.
Okay, common moles?
Right. However, they state that a significant number of these marks do differ in appearance compared to typical moles. They might be raised or maybe depigmented, so lighter than the surrounding skin.
Or darker.
Or hyperpigmented, yes, darker. Some are linear, like a scar. Others might have an unusual texture or shape. The idea is that while a single ordinary mole is common, finding one in a very specific location that happens to correspond to a known injury on a specific previous personality, that's what makes it noteworthy in this context.
Okay, so the specific appearance and the specific location together are key. What about single marks corresponding to specific wounds, like one mark, one wound?
This is the most basic type of physical correspondence they describe. A child has a birthmark, and their memories and statements lead the investigators to identify a deceased person who suffered a fatal or maybe just a significant wound at the same location on their body.
Do the sources give examples?
Oh yes, several compelling ones. There's the case of Haniman, who had a noticeable birthmark on his buttock. He claimed to remember being Maharam, a farmer who was killed by a shotgun.
Okay.
And Maharam's fatal shotgun wound, confirmed by records or testimony, was also on his buttock. What's more, Haniman even reported experiencing pain in that specific area intermittently, starting around age 14.
Wow, a physical symptom, like phantom pain almost, linked to the location of the mark and the remembered death.
Yeah, pretty striking. Another case mentioned is Charles Porter, a Tlingit man. He had a large, prominent, pigmented birthmark on his right flank. He remembered being killed by a spear in a clan fight, and historical accounts and testimony apparently confirmed the spear wound was in that exact location. Utin Sand is another example cited, with a round, flat, dark mark, a hyperpigmented macule, basically a type of nevus on his body that corresponded in location to an injury.
So it's not just the presence of any old mark, but its specific location relative to the previous personality's body and their specific injury that's being correlated.
That's the core of it.
Now, where it gets particularly striking, I think, is with multiple marks. The sources talk about cases with 2 birthmarks corresponding to entry and exit wounds from gunshots. That seems harder to explain away.
Yes, this category is presented as especially significant evidence precisely because it involves multiple specific points of correspondence. It's much harder to dismiss that as mere chance, you see.
Right.
They investigated cases where a child had 2 birthmarks located in positions on their body that seemed to mirror the entry and exit points of a bullet or maybe a shotgun blast on the body of the deceased person they remembered being.
And how many cases like this did they actually document?
Stevenson investigated 14 such cases himself, and his associates investigated another 4. So that brings the total to 18 documented cases with this apparent double birthmark correspondence related to gunshot wounds.
18 cases with that specific distinct pattern. And you mentioned a fascinating observation about the relative size of these 2 marks.
Yes, and this is where the connection to forensic science becomes really interesting, as the sources definitely highlight. In 14 out of these 18 cases, the 2 birthmarks were of noticeably different sizes. One mark was larger, the other was smaller.
Okay.
Now, crucially, in 9 of those 14 cases where there was a size difference, the smaller mark corresponded in location to the documented entry wound on the deceased previous personality, and the larger mark corresponded to the exit wound.
And that aligns with what forensic pathologists expect from gunshot wounds, that exit wounds are usually bigger.
Absolutely. The sources explain that in forensic pathology, exit wounds are almost invariably larger than entry wounds.
Why is that?
Well, it's because as a bullet passes through tissue, it often tumbles or yaws. It might pick up bone fragments or tissue fragments, and it basically pushes all of that material ahead of it. So it creates a larger, often more irregular wound as it exits the body compared to the relatively cleaner hole where it first entered.
So the child's birthmarks, present from the moment they were born, physically replicate a specific pattern found in fatal gunshot injuries as understood by forensic science. That's a remarkable and incredibly specific correlation. Seems difficult to just account for randomly.
That is precisely the argument made in the sources. They list several subjects with this double mark pattern, names like Mong Sein Wen, Henry Elkin, Chanai Chumalawang, Mong Tin Win, Metin, Tully Soad, Alan Gamble, Kamel Farici. The sheer specificity of having two marks in the correct relative locations and with the size differential matching forensic expectations. Well, it's presented as a really powerful piece of physical evidence.
Definitely harder to brush off as coincidence. What about other types of distinct injuries, like maybe surgical procedures? Did birthmarks correspond to those as well?
Yes, the sources describe birthmarks that appeared to correspond to surgical scars on the previous personality. These often presented as linear marks, sometimes with small sort of punctate marks alongside them.
Like little dots?
Yeah, exactly. Resembling stitch wounds from a surgical closure. They give the example of Corliss Chodkin Jr., who had a linear scar-like mark with these small accompanying marks that looked like stitch marks.
And was that particular case fully verified against a medical record? Do they know for sure the previous person had surgery there?
Well, the sources are careful to note the limitations, which is good. In Corliss Chodkin Jr.'s case, they found a medical record indicating the previous personality had a condition for which surgery or maybe a biopsy might have been performed in that area.
Might have been.
Right. But they couldn't obtain definitive documentation proving that a biopsy was actually done and that it occurred at the exact location of the birthmark. So they acknowledged that specific case had a gap in full verification.
Okay. Transparency about limitations is definitely important for scientific credibility. Any other examples of non-fatal or specific injuries showing up as marks?
They mention a birthmark corresponding to a mastoidectomy scar, that's surgery behind the ear, and it leaves a distinctive sort of crescentic scar. The birthmark matched that shape.
Wow.
Another case involved a Burmese woman with two small round birthmarks of different sizes on her breast. These reportedly correlated with wounds from shotgun pellets of different sizes on the previous personality's body.
Two different size pellets, two different size marks.
Apparently so. And Savitri Devi had a mark on her thumbnail that she attributed to a weight having been dropped on her thumb in her previous life. So specific, non-lethal, but distinct injuries potentially showing up.
So it's not just death wounds then, but other kinds of trauma or medical procedures. Now let's talk about birth defects. This seems even more dramatic. How do more significant physical deformities correlate in these cases?
Right. The sources document cases where significant birth defects, major malformations, or even missing body parts appeared to correlate with severe injuries or sometimes mutilations suffered by the previous personality.
Can you give us some examples of that from the sources?
Sure. There are cases where children were born with, say, missing fingers or toes or maybe malformed limbs that corresponded to chopping injuries sustained by the previous personality.
Like an accident.
Yeah. For example, Lek Powell remembered being Hukum Singh, a boy whose fingers were severed in a fodder chopping machine accident. And Lek Powell himself had a birth defect involving his hand. Another case, Suklal Sharma, had a very rare congenital anomaly of his right hand, which apparently matched injuries from a murder the previous personality suffered.
A rare defect matching a specific injury is, again, statistically, that's got to be quite remarkable if it's just chance.
Yes, the sources definitely present it that way. They also discuss something called constriction rings.
What are those?
They're deep, fibrous grooves that can appear on a limb. They're a known, though relatively rare, birth defect. In some of these cases, these rings appear to correlate with the previous personality having been, say, tied up with ropes, or maybe having suffered deep cuts in that location. And then there are even more severe defects documented, like hypoplasia that's underdevelopment of a limb, or even missing limbs altogether. Terms like hemimelia, phocomelia describe these severe limb deficiencies.
And these correlated with injuries, too.
In some cases, yes. Wijeratno, for instance, had Poland syndrome. That's a specific birth defect involving underdevelopment of the chest muscle and often affects the hand or arm on that side. He claimed this was linked to his having murdered his fiancée in the previous life, maybe some kind of karmic consequence.
Wow.
And Mahatri Win, who had defects in her legs, was quoted as saying, apparently referencing her remembered murderers, "Look at what they did to me, how cruel they were," directly linking her physical state to the past trauma.
These are significant, often visible physical challenges for the child, which the sources are linking directly to severe trauma in the previous life. Now, the sources also mention something called experimental birth defects among the Igbo people of Nigeria. That sounds quite different, maybe even disturbing.
It is a fascinating and yet culturally specific phenomenon described in the sources. Among some Igbo communities, there is a belief in Ogbonje. These were thought to be children who repeatedly died in infancy and were believed to be reborn to the same mother, only to die again.
Like a cycle.
A tragic cycle. To prevent a child suspected of being an Ogbanje from returning, they would sometimes perform a specific mutilation on the deceased infant's body.
On the dead baby.
Yes, like amputating a fingertip or making a distinctive mark, sometimes even more severe mutilations. The idea was to make the body undesirable or identifiable if it tried to come back.
Okay.
And the sources document cases where children were later born to that same family, or perhaps a related family, with birth defects that corresponded precisely to these specific mutilations performed on the deceased infant.
Wait, so a deliberate act performed on a dead baby correlated with a specific physical defect on a baby born later. That seems to challenge the idea of random chance pretty strongly, doesn't it?
It's presented as very compelling evidence within that specific cultural context. They describe cases like Cordelia. Her mother had disposed of a bag containing body remnants of a suspected Ogbanje baby, and the father, apparently fearing the baby would still return but be malformed because of how the remains were treated, was distraught when Cordelia was later born with a serious malformation.
Wow.
They also mentioned Florence, whose birth defects reportedly corresponded to mutilations her uncle had made on his own dead baby. Interestingly, Florence reportedly had no remembered images or memories of a previous life, unlike most cases.
So the physical link might exist even without the conscious memory aspect.
That's what that case suggests, potentially. It implies the mechanism causing the physical mark might operate independently of conscious recall in some instances.
That Igbo example is particularly stark. Let's loop back to the idea of chance coincidence that we touched on earlier. The sources acknowledge that a single birthmark could coincide with a wound location just by chance. But for multiple marks.
Right. This is where the statistical argument against chance, as presented in the sources, becomes much more robust, mathematically speaking.
How so?
Well, they estimate the odds. They say the probability of a single mark of a certain size falling within a specific, say, 10 centimeter square area on the body and matching a wound known to be in that area might be something like maybe 1 in 160. Plausible, perhaps.
Yeah, not impossible for one mark.
But the probability of two such marks appearing in locations corresponding to two specific wounds on the same deceased person, well, those odds multiply. For two marks, using that rough 1160 figure, it would be 1160 times 1160.
Riches.
Roughly 1 in 25,600. Much less likely to be just random chance.
Okay, so two correlating marks makes it statistically quite improbable by chance alone.
And they note that there are documented cases with more than two corresponding marks. 3 or even more. Which, reduces the probability of a chance explanation to vanishingly small levels. Astronomically improbable, basically.
The sources also mention that these physical marks aren't necessarily static. They can change over the child's development. How does that factor in?
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. They note that birthmarks can indeed fade over time. They give the example of Derek, whose mark on his toe was apparently no longer visible by the time he was 7 years old.
Okay, they can fade.
They also note that the relative position of a mark can sometimes shift on the growing body. For example, Ravi Shankar had a mark on his neck that appeared to shift upwards, sort of towards his chin area as he grew into a teenager. Govind Narain Mishra's mark near his upper thigh also seemed to shift position relative to landmarks as he grew.
So the mark itself is stable, but its exact location relative to, say, bones or other features might change as the body proportions change with growth.
That seems to be the interpretation in the sources. They note that marks on extremities, hands, or feet seem less prone to this apparent positional shift than marks on the trunk, head, or neck, which undergo more proportional change during growth.
But the key thing is that the mark was present at birth, at a location correlating to the previous personality's wound, even if its precise position seems to shift a bit later on.
That's the crucial point they make, yes.
Okay. Beyond just marks and defects, did the sources note any other potential physical or biological correlations that seem to carry over from these supposed past lives?
Yes, the sources mention other observed physical similarities, although apparently Stevenson became more aware of these and started documenting them more systematically later in his research career.
Like what kind of things?
These included potential correlations in the pigmentation of skin and hair. They cite that intriguing case of Mangza Wunang again. Remember, he was albino.
The boy who claimed to be an American aviator.
Right. Albino, yet claimed to remember being a fair-skinned American aviator. And apparently, his family did have fair-skinned, blonde individuals in their ancestry. So the suggestion is maybe a kind of exaggerated carryover of pigmentation traits, resulting in albinism in his case.
Interesting speculation. What else?
They also noted possible similarities in facial appearance between the child and the previous personality, based on photos or descriptions. Similarities in overall physique, and even things like posture and gait, the way someone walks or holds themselves.
So it's presented as potentially a broader physical patterning effect, not just these very specific isolated marks or defects.
Right. It suggests perhaps a more pervasive influence on the physical form, although clearly the birthmarks and birth defects are presented as the most frequent, the most dramatic, and often the most objectively verifiable examples.
This physical evidence is certainly striking. But, as with any research into extraordinary claims, it's absolutely crucial to consider alternative explanations. The sources dedicate significant space to discussing and attempting to counter potential non-reincarnation explanations, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. And that's vital for evaluating the research properly. They systematically examine alternative interpretations, both what they term normal explanations, things within our standard understanding of the world, and also other paranormal explanations besides reincarnation.
Okay, let's start with the normal ones. We already talked about chance coincidence, especially for single marks.
Right, for a single birthmark matching a single wound, chance is acknowledged as a more plausible explanation compared to cases with multiple correspondences. The sources still find the location matching a known wound noteworthy, but they don't claim it's statistically impossible by chance alone for just one mark.
Makes sense. What about genetics? Could these marks or defects simply be genetic inheritance passed down through the family?
That's a common question. The sources acknowledge that genetics obviously plays a huge role in determining whether someone might develop a nevus, a mole, or is perhaps predisposed to certain birth defects. That's standard biology.
Sure.
However, they argue that genetics doesn't explain the specificity found in these cases. Why would this specific child in this specific family have a specific mark at a specific location that corresponds precisely to a wound on a deceased person to whom they are not genetically related?
The lack of genetic connection is key.
It is. They also point to studies showing that even monozygotic identical twins who share identical genes can be discordant for certain conditions, meaning only one twin might have schizophrenia or a specific birth defect while the other doesn't.
Even with the same genes.
Right. Which clearly shows that non-genetic factors do influence where and how certain physical traits or conditions manifest, even in genetically identical individuals.
So the argument is, genetics might load the gun, maybe, but it doesn't explain why it fires at the specific target location corresponding to the previous personality's injury, especially when there's no family link.
That's a good way to put it, yes. That's the essence of their arguments against genetics as a full explanation here.
Okay. What about environmental factors during pregnancy? Exposure to substances that cause birth defects, teratogens.
The sources agree that environmental factors, including known teratogens, are definitely causes of birth defects. And the first trimester of pregnancy is a particularly susceptible period for these influences.
Right.
And that timing aligns somewhat with the timing proposed for some of these potential influences leading to birth defects or marks in these cases. However, they argue that this explanation still doesn't account for the extreme specificity of the defect or mark matching a particular wound on a particular deceased person.
Especially if the mother didn't know about that person or the wounds.
Exactly. That's the crucial point they raise. They identified 25 cases where they were confident the mother had no knowledge of the previous personality's specific injuries during her pregnancy.
25 cases like that?
Yes. And in those cases, the environmental factor of the mother's knowledge or experience simply wouldn't be present to somehow cause a specific corresponding mark on the fetus. The mechanism just isn't there.
That's a key point. If the mother didn't know about the injury, it's really hard to argue her environment or her experience somehow caused the correlating mark on the fetus.
Okay, what about the memory aspect? This seems like a major area of skepticism for many people.
It is.
Could the informant, or maybe even the child later on, have somehow picked up information, normally overheard conversations, saw pictures, read old newspapers, forgotten where they learned it, and then sincerely but mistakenly believe the child has genuine past life memories? The sources mention terms like cryptomnesia, source amnesia, paramnesia. Yes, this is indeed a major criticism Stevenson faced, and it's something he addressed quite extensively, as presented in the sources. Cryptomnesia is that idea of unknowingly learning something and forgetting the source. Source amnesia is similar, remembering the info, but not where you got it. Paramnesia involves distorted or false memories.
Okay.
So the skeptical argument is basically that informants' parents, family members, might overhear conversations about a local deceased person, maybe see an old photo, read an old newspaper article, forget they learned it that way, and then completely sincerely attribute this knowledge to the child's memories when the child says something that seems to fit.
So not necessarily deliberate lying, but a kind of trick of memory leading to an honest but mistaken belief?
Exactly that. It's a plausible psychological mechanism in general. Stevenson's counterarguments, though, as laid out in the sources, include several points. Firstly, he questions how a very young child remember. Often the memories and detailed statements are strongest between ages 2 and 5, and they tend to fade by 7 or 8. Could realistically absorb and integrate such a volume of complex, often very specific, verifiable details about a stranger's life and death from just a single or even a few overheard conversations.
Yeah, kids that age, their understanding is limited.
Right. Children at that age often lack the cognitive capacity, the vocabulary, and the ability to synthesize information in such a complex way. It seems unlikely they could stitch together a coherent, detailed, and verifiable narrative just from fragments overheard.
Good point. It's hard to imagine a toddler doing that convincingly.
Secondly, he points back to his analyses of inconsistencies in the children's statements. While minor errors did exist, he found the overall accuracy of major details, particularly those verifiable against records or the previous family's testimony, was surprisingly high. He argues this suggests the memories weren't wildly distorted or simply fabricated from random bits of overheard information.
But it's still incredibly hard to prove a negative, right? To prove that the information could not possibly have been learned normally.
He absolutely acknowledges this difficulty. It's a standard challenge in this kind of research. The investigators made extensive efforts to identify all possible normal sources of information in the child's environment. Did the families know each other? Was there a newspaper report? Etc. But definitive proof that zero information was acquired normally is almost impossible to achieve in every single case.
So what was his conclusion on this point?
He concluded that while this remains a possible explanation in some cases, especially weaker ones, it just doesn't seem sufficient to explain the sheer volume, the specificity, and the accuracy of the verifiable details, especially when combined with the physical correspondences like birthmarks in many of the strongest cases. He felt something else was likely going on and stressed that independent replication of the research was needed to further test this alternative.
Okay. What about deliberate fraud or coaching? The idea that the parents or someone else is actively coaching the child to make these claims, perhaps for attention or, I don't know, financial gain?
This is another common skeptical explanation, and it's also addressed in the sources. Stevenson's counterpoints here include, first, that parents often seem to lack a clear motive for coaching,
Why is that?
particularly if the claimed previous life was one of low status, or involved a violent, unpleasant death, or resulted in a birth defect correlating to that death which the child now has to live with. Why would parents invent that kind of story?
Good point. It's not always a glamorous past life being claimed.
Not at all. In fact, the sources state that in many cultures where these cases arise, parents are often distressed or embarrassed by the child's statements and behaviors. They actively try to suppress the memories, not encourage them.
Because it can be disruptive or maybe socially undesirable in their community.
Exactly. The sources also question the practical feasibility of coaching a very young child, again, often 2 to 5 years old, to consistently produce such a large number of highly specific and verifiable details, including things like the complex entry-exit wound correlations, without any evidence of coercion or intensive training being apparent to the investigators during multiple, often unannounced visits.
Right. Keeping that consistent under scrutiny would be tough for a little kid.
Very tough. They do cite one specific case, Jagdish Chandra, where accusations of coaching were made involving a cousin. But Stevenson's investigation into that specific accusation suggested it was unfounded, partly because the alleged coach had actually died before the time key verifications involving him could have occurred.
So, they actively investigated accusations of fraud when they arose and found them often unsupported or at least questionable in the specific instances they examined.
That appears to be the case based on the sources.
Okay, one more normal explanation. What about the influence of cultural beliefs? If people strongly believe in reincarnation, might they unconsciously interpret ambiguous statements from a child in a way that fits and supports that belief, kind of seeing what they expect to see?
The sources acknowledge this as a valid concern. A strong cultural belief in reincarnation could certainly influence how informants perceive, interpret, and then report a child's statements. It might lead them to highlight things they might otherwise dismiss, or maybe filling gaps unconsciously.
Sure, confirmation bias.
Exactly. However, they argue that while cultural belief might provide a fertile ground or a framework for reporting these cases, it doesn't actually explain the specificity of the verifiable details that the child often provides, particularly the precise correspondences between birthmarks or defects and documented wounds on an unrelated deceased person. Belief alone doesn't seem to create those specific, objective correlations.
Can you give an example of that?
They offer a really interesting example involving the Jain religion in India. Jains have a very strong belief in reincarnation. However, their specific doctrine holds that the soul is instantly reborn immediately after death. No gap.
Okay.
So when Stevenson presented Jain scholars with evidence of birthmarks correlating to wounds on a person who had been dead for some time, months or years before the child's birth, the scholars apparently found the idea laughably absurd.
Why? Because it contradicted their specific belief?
Precisely.
Yeah.
It contradicted their specific doctrine about the timing of rebirth. So in this case, their strong cultural belief in reincarnation actually made them reject this particular type of physical evidence because it didn't fit their specific doctrinal framework.
That's a powerful counterpoint. It illustrates that just having a general belief doesn't automatically lead to accepting any claim as evidence, especially if it conflicts with the details of that belief.
Exactly. It shows that cultural belief might provide a context for reporting and interpretation, but it doesn't seem sufficient in itself to explain the emergence of highly detailed, verifiable correlations, especially the physical ones, independent of those beliefs.
Okay, so putting it together, the sources systematically present these alternative, normal explanations: chance, genetics, environment, faulty memory, deliberate fraud, cultural shaping, and then provide Stevenson's arguments and evidence from the cases, attempting to show why these explanations, either individually or maybe in combination, do not seem to fully account for the specific complex patterns observed in the strongest cases, particularly that combination of physical correspondences and detailed, verifiable statements.
That's essentially how the research is presented, yes. Not as offering definitive proof that eliminates all doubt, but as presenting evidence that is highly anomalous and challenging to explain solely by known normal processes, especially when you look at the whole pattern across many cases.
Let's briefly touch on other paranormal explanations the sources discuss, besides just reincarnation. What about the idea of possession? Could it be some other entity influencing the child?
Possession is considered as an alternative, the idea that a discarnate entity, a spirit perhaps, influences or maybe even takes over the child's body or mind.
Okay.
However, the sources present critiques of this as a complete explanation for these specific types of cases, the ones with birthmarks and childhood memories. Firstly, it doesn't easily explain the birthmarks themselves because those are present at birth.
Right. Possession usually implies influence after birth.
Generally, yes. For possession to cause a birthmark, the influence would seemingly have to begin during gestation, during pregnancy. And as the sources note, if the influence starts before birth and affects the physical body's development, well, that starts to blur the line between possession and reincarnation anyway.
Yeah. How is that functionally different from some aspect of a previous personality influencing the new body from conception, which is basically the reincarnation idea?
Precisely. Secondly, possession doesn't readily explain the almost universal pattern in these cases where the child's memories or the apparent influence fades significantly between the ages of 5 and 8. Why would a possessing entity typically just leave or fade away around that specific age range in so many unrelated children across different cultures? It doesn't seem to fit a standard possession model.
Any cases that do seem more like possession?
They do mention cases with what they call anomalous dates. These are cases where a child remembers the life of a person who was actually still living at the time the child was born. Those, they suggest, might fit a possession model better, but they emphasize these are distinct from the typical cases involving a deceased previous personality and birthmarks.
Okay. What about the older concept of maternal impressions? The historical idea that a pregnant mother's strong experiences, thoughts, or emotions could somehow physically mark or affect the fetus she's carrying.
The sources acknowledge this concept and actually discuss it quite seriously. The idea that a mother's vivid experience or thought during pregnancy could impact the developing baby physically.
Was this seen as a potential explanation?
It was considered a rival explanation, particularly in those cases where the mother did have knowledge of the deceased person's injuries during her pregnancy. They even reviewed historical literature on maternal impressions and found some quite striking historical accounts. They also noted that the exposure to the supposed stimulus, the shocking event or thought, was often reported in the first trimester, which aligns biologically with the critical period for fetal development when major malformations can occur.
So they took this historical idea seriously as a potential mechanism, at least in some cases.
Yes, they seem to. However, they also present what they see as significant limitations from maternal impressions as a full explanation for the entirety of the evidence in their collection.
What are the main limitations?
Well, the biggest one goes back to those 25 cases we mentioned earlier, where they felt confident the child's mother had no knowledge whatsoever of the previous personality's specific wounds during the pregnancy.
Right. Can't have a maternal impression of something you don't know about.
Exactly. In those cases, a maternal impression derived from the mother's own knowledge or experience simply cannot account for the correlating physical mark on the child. The causal link is missing.
Okay.
Furthermore, even if maternal impressions could somehow explain a physical mark in cases where the mother did know something, they argue it does not explain all the other stuff. The child's detailed, specific statements, their unusual behaviors, their specific phobias, their recognitions of people and places from the previous life. Maternal impression traditionally is about a physical mark, not implanting a whole personality and memory set.
So it only explains one part of the puzzle, potentially.
Right. The sources argue that proposing the mother somehow unconsciously implanted both the specific physical mark and the entire suite of behavioral and memory correspondences stretches the concept of maternal impression far beyond what any evidence supports. And again, it lacks a plausible mechanism for how a parent could successfully program a young child with all that complex, verifiable detail without detection.
Okay. So they evaluated these alternative explanations, both normal and other paranormal ones, and argued, based on the case details they collected, that while these might account for parts of the evidence in some cases, they don't seem sufficient to explain the full complex pattern, especially that combination of specific, verifiable physical correspondences and detailed behavioral and memory matches, particularly in those key cases where the mother had no prior knowledge of the previous personality's injuries.
That's the core of their argument, as presented in the sources, yes. That the total collection of evidence across numerous cases, especially when you focus on those physical correlations, is highly anomalous and resists easy explanation by the known normal processes or the other paranormal alternatives they considered.
Okay. Stepping slightly away from the physical marks themselves for a moment, the sources describe other associated phenomena that frequently appeared alongside these remembered lives. While maybe not physical evidence in the same tangible way, they are presented as potentially linked psychological or behavioral carryovers. What are some of these?
One really notable phenomenon is the high incidence of phobias that seem directly linked to the mode of death in the previous life. They found about 35% of subjects showed these specific phobias.
Like a child who remembers drowning having an intense, irrational fear of water.
Exactly that kind of thing. Examples include phobias of water in drowning cases, intense fear of loud noises or guns in shooting cases, or phobias related to specific vehicles, cars, trucks, planes in accident cases.
And these appear early.
Yes, the sources highlight that these phobias often appear very early in the child's life, sometimes even before they can speak clearly about memories. And crucially, there's often no apparent trigger or model for the fear within the child's current family or environment. The parents might have no fear of water, for instance. This suggests a potential link to the trauma of the previous death.
That's a very specific psychological carryover correlating to the claimed past event. What about unusual interests or types of play that seem out of character for the current family?
This is also frequently reported in about 40% of the cases studied. The children exhibit play patterns, or maybe specific interests, sometimes even apparent skills, that are unusual within their current family context, but are highly congruent with the previous personality's life, maybe their job or a hobby, or even related to the circumstances of their death.
Can you give an example from the sources again?
Sure, the case of Maung Sa Winom, the supposed American aviator in Myanmar, is mentioned here too. He reportedly demonstrated play that involved mimicking flying airplanes and expressed a really strong desire to become a fighter pilot. That's obviously very unusual for a child in rural Myanmar at that time.
Okay, so behavior aligning with the claimed past identity. What about simple things like food preferences? Did those carry over?
The sources note that children sometimes showed strong likes or dislikes for specific foods that were unusual in their current family, but were known to be preferred or disliked by the previous personality. Bunkuk Tromson, for example, apparently had an intense craving for sticky rice, which was known to be the favorite food of the youth he remembered being. Mengzhao Winong, the aviator boy again, reportedly asked for milk and biscuits and resisted eating with his hands, a common practice in his culture, but not typically Western. Small details, maybe, but potentially aligning with the previous life's habits or cultural background.
Interesting how those mundane habits might persist. What about gender identity issues? The sources mention confusion in some cases.
Yes, this is a significant category. There are documented cases where children claim to have been the opposite sex in the previous life and then exhibited cross-gender behaviors in their current life.
Like what kind of behaviors?
Wanting to wear clothes, typically associated with the opposite sex, identifying strongly with the opposite gender, sometimes even expressing distress or unhappiness about their anatomical sex.
Does this usually last?
The sources note that in most of these cases, these behaviors tend to diminish as the child grows older, and they eventually accept their current biological gender.
But not always.
Not always. A small number of subjects apparently continue to exhibit these cross-gender identifications strongly into adulthood. This sometimes led to significant distress or attempts to live as the opposite sex. Examples cited include Matinon Mayo, Paulo Lorenz, and Ronnie Saxena, who, even into middle age, reportedly still used masculine grammatical forms when speaking Hindi, a language where verb forms clearly indicate the speaker's gender.
Wow, that's persistent.
It is. The sources also touch briefly on how different cultures view this, noting variations, like the Tlingit in Alaska having different narratives about sex change and rebirth depending on the specific clan story, and the traditional Burmese view that being reborn as a woman after being a man is considered a kind of spiritual demotion.
Those cultural lenses are definitely important context for how these identities might be expressed or perceived by the family and community. What about broader personality traits or attitudes? Did those seem to carry over?
The sources describe apparent carryovers in personality and specific behavior patterns, too. This includes attitudes like, say, vengefulness towards those perceived as murderers from the past life. Vongkuch Promson would reportedly beat a post while naming the alleged murderers. Mucky Chui Vin expressed a desire for revenge.
Though presumably they couldn't act on it.
Right. And other cases showed subjects abandoning thoughts of revenge later in life. Forgiveness towards past wrongdoers was also noted sometimes. Social status awareness could also seem to carry over. Jesbir Singh, born into a poor family, exhibited strong caste snobbishness, refused to eat food prepared by his current family because he felt they were beneath him, and later reportedly even experienced job difficulties because he still saw himself as belonging to a higher caste.
That must have caused problems.
You'd imagine so. Sometimes specific skills or maybe physical habits seem to carry over, like Maki and Sandy being strongly left-handed, which apparently matched a disability of the previous personality that forced her to use her left hand predominantly.
It's like fragments of the previous personality, psychological traits, attitudes, maybe even physiological habits like handedness manifesting in the new life.
What about a sense of longing or maybe unfinished business? Did the kids talk about that?
Yes, this is a frequently reported aspect, apparently quite common. Children often express a strong desire to return to the previous family or their previous home or the location where they used to live.
What drives that longing?
It can stem from different things. Sometimes just attachment to the previous life's circumstances, like Indika Gunaratne, who reportedly kept wanting to go back to the mansion his previous personality had owned. Or it can be driven by a sense of needing to complete tasks or resolve unfinished business. Examples like Suklagupta or Lalitha Abeyawardena expressed deep concern for the children they believed they had left behind in the previous life.
Kind of parental anxiety carrying over. It seems like it. Sometimes it's described as a simpler feeling, just a deep homesickness for a familiar place. The sources mention the Spanish word querencia, that profound liking for, or pull towards, a place of origin. Prakash Varshney's case is cited as an example of this simple longing for a place.
That longing for a former place or family is a powerful, very relatable human feeling, even if its supposed source here is highly unusual. What about the characteristics of the memories themselves? Do they follow any particular pattern in terms of what's remembered?
The sources note that the memories the children report tend to be fragmented, not usually a complete life narrative. They often focus heavily on the events leading up to and including the death of the previous personality.
Especially if the death was traumatic.
Yes, especially if it was violent. Apparently, nearly 3/4 of subjects who remember a previous life claim to remember their death, particularly if it was violent. The researchers observed a general pattern where these memories are most vivid and detailed between the ages of approximately 2, and 5.
That early childhood window again.
Right. And then they typically begin to fade, usually disappearing altogether by age 7 or 8. And interestingly, this fading seems to happen whether the family encouraged the memories or actively tried to suppress them.
So it's not just suppression causing them to fade.
Apparently not always. The sources speculate that memories might also fade naturally while in a discarnate state between lives, which could potentially explain why some cases seem much stronger or more detailed than others.
And dreams. You mentioned dreams briefly before. Are dreams relevant in these cases?
Yes, two types mainly. Announcing dreams are mentioned frequently, especially in certain cultures.
What are those?
That's where the deceased person reportedly appears to a prospective parent, or maybe another family member, in a dream, announcing their intention to be reborn into that specific family. These are noted as being particularly common in Tlingit and Burmese cultures, although the cultural interpretation of the timing and significance can differ.
Okay. And the other type?
Recurrent, vivid nightmares are also sometimes reported by the children. These often appear to be reenactments of the traumatic death experience from the previous life. Alice Robertson's terrifying nightmare is given as an example. The sources cautiously suggest these recurrent vivid dreams may stem from the previous life's trauma, but acknowledge they are very difficult to verify objectively.
Makes sense. Finally, before we move to interpretation, were there any cases where the child seemed to remember events that happened after the previous personality had actually died, like things they couldn't have experienced themselves?
Yes, a few cases apparently report this, which presents yet another layer of complexity. For instance, Thusari Wijaya Singh reportedly remembered events that occurred after the previous personality's death, including a specific detail about a temple burning down sometime later.
How could that work?
It's puzzling. Some subjects also claim to remember being seen as apparitions or ghosts after their death, and in a small number of instances, living people independently confirmed having seen an apparition of the deceased person around that time. So hints of post-mortem consciousness or awareness.
So the sources present this whole suite of interconnected phenomena, the physical marks and defects, the specific phobias linked to the death, unusual behaviors and interests, food preferences, gender identity issues, personality traits carrying over, that sense of longing, the specific characteristics of the memories and their fading, the role of dreams, and even these hints of alleged post-death awareness, all seemingly correlating in various combinations with the claimed previous life.
It's really the consistency and the convergence of these different types of correspondences across numerous cases, gathered from different cultures, that the sources present as the significant evidence requiring explanation. Not just one thing, but a whole pattern.
Okay, this is undeniably complex, and it definitely pushes the boundaries of our conventional understanding of, well, everything. How does Stevenson himself interpret all of this, based on the sources? It's noted several times that he was quite cautious in his conclusions.
Yes, the sources really emphasize his cautious scientific approach. He consistently stated, apparently, that while he found the evidence strongly suggestive of reincarnation, he did not believe it constituted absolute, definitive proof, especially not proof that would convince everyone, particularly someone coming from a standard Western, materialistic, scientific background.
He wasn't claiming certainty.
No, more like presenting anomalous evidence that strongly pointed in a particular direction, but still required more study.
What conceptual framework did he use to try and understand this, then? The sources mention interaction as dualism. What's that?
He discussed interactionist dualism as a philosophical framework that could potentially accommodate this kind of evidence. Dualism basically is the concept that mind and body are fundamentally distinct kinds of things, but that they can causally interact with each other.
Okay, so mind isn't just brain activity.
Right. This contrasts sharply with materialism, or physicalism, which is the dominant view in much of modern science and philosophy. Materialism holds that mind is simply a product of brain activity, ultimately reducible to physical processes. Proponents of dualism don't deny the brain's crucial role in consciousness and thought, obviously, but they deny that the mind is nothing but brain activity.
And Stevenson used an analogy.
Yeah, he sometimes used the analogy of the brain acting perhaps like a receiver or maybe a filter for consciousness or memory, rather than the sole generator of it.
So a model where the mind, or at least some aspect of consciousness or identity, could potentially exist separately from the physical brain and could theoretically survive the physical death of that brain.
Exactly. This provides a conceptual space, a way of thinking, where the evidence of children seeming to remember previous lives might fit, whereas a strict materialist view where consciousness dies when the brain dies, struggles profoundly to explain how detailed memories and personality traits could possibly persist and reappear in a new body.
Makes sense as a framework. And what about the mechanism? How could this information, especially the physical blueprints for the birthmarks, actually be carried from one life to the next? What did he propose there?
This is where it gets more speculative, naturally. He proposed the term psychophore.
Psycho 4, mind carrier.
Literally, yes, mind carrying. He introduced this term specifically trying to be neutral, to avoid the baggage of religious terms like soul or spirit. He suggested the psychophore was a hypothetical intermediate vehicle, or maybe a kind of template.
A template.
Yes, a template that somehow carries these physical memories like the propensity for birthmark, cognitive memories, behavioral tendencies from one life to the next.
So a kind of non-physical blueprint or information field that persists after death.
That's the basic idea presented in the sources, yes. This hypothetical template, the psychophore, would then somehow have to interact with and influence a developing embryo or fetus in the next life.
How exactly would this psychophore influence the new body to create something as specific as a birthmark corresponding to an old knife wound, or a defect matching a gunshot exit wound? That seems like the biggest mechanistic challenge, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And this is where the sources delve into even more speculative mechanisms based on trying to interpret the observed correlations. They suggest possible modes of influence. For instance, maybe the psychophore selects specific parents who are genetically predisposed to certain traits, or maybe even select specific conceptuses or embryos.
Okay, selection. What else?
But the most direct influence proposed for the physical marks is the idea that the discarnate personality's template, the psychophore, directly interacts with the developing fetal tissues.
Like imprinting onto the developing body.
Sort of. The sources even speculate, based on cases like those with constriction rings or severe deformities, that this might involve a kind of contest or struggle.
A contest.
Yeah, a contest between the normal biological processes of embryonic development and what they term destructive ones that the assumed psychic force of the previous personality generates, trying to impose the old injury pattern onto the new form.
Wow. A contest between the biological program and the psychic template trying to imprint the old body's injuries onto the new one. That's highly speculative for sure. But I guess it attempts to provide some kind of conceptual link between the proposed psychic carrier and the very specific physical manifestations observed.
It's definitely pushing the boundaries of current biological understanding, but it's an attempt to formulate a hypothesis, however tentative, that could account for the data.
So what broader scientific or philosophical questions does Stevenson's research raise, according to the sources? What are the big takeaways?
Well, they argue that this research, particularly the physical evidence, which is harder to dismiss as purely psychological, raises fundamental questions that are still unresolved even within mainstream science. Like, how do minds and brains actually interact? Even materialist neuroscience hasn't fully cracked that nut, the so-called hard problem of consciousness.
Right.
The evidence presented here, they argue, poses a significant challenge to the dominant materialist view of consciousness, the idea that consciousness is only what the brain does and nothing more.
It's evidence that just doesn't fit neatly into the current scientific paradigm if it's accepted as valid.
Exactly. They acknowledge the inherent difficulty in studying these kinds of spontaneous, often non-reproducible paranormal-seeming phenomena under controlled laboratory conditions. And they acknowledge the necessary reliance on human testimony in field research, with all its potential flaws. But they maintain that if the evidence collected, especially the convergence of different lines of evidence in strong cases, is taken seriously, well, it seems to require a fundamental reconsideration, maybe even radical revision, as they put it, in our present concepts of the relationship between mind and body.
And the sources even suggest that the belief in reincarnation itself might be something that carries over, not just memories, but the belief system.
Yes, that's another speculative idea they float, that a predisposition towards believing in reincarnation, perhaps as a kind of mental set or an intuitive feeling, might itself be carried over from one life to the next. This could then provide a psychological framework through which subsequent unusual experiences, like remembering bits of a previous life, might be interpreted by the individual.
So not necessarily a conscious memory of the belief, but maybe a kind of cognitive or intuitive leaning that makes the idea feel natural or plausible to them.
Something like that, yeah. It's another layer to consider in the whole complex picture.
So how does this research move forward? Where do things go from here, scientifically speaking?
The sources consistently emphasize that the way forward, scientifically, has to be through replication and independent research. They mention that other researchers have begun investigating similar cases in different parts of the world, trying to replicate Stevenson's methods and findings, ideally to build a larger, independently verified body of evidence that can be scrutinized by the wider scientific community.
Makes sense. Independent confirmation is key in science.
Absolutely.
So to kind of bring this deep dive into the sources together, we've explored this really systematic research into children's claims of remembering previous lives. We've dug into the specific details about the physical evidence, these birthmarks and birth defects that appear to correspond, sometimes with startling accuracy, to wounds or marks on deceased individuals, down to forensic details like entry and exit wounds even.
Yeah, and we've seen how this research attempts to document these correlations meticulously, and how it systematically addressed those potential alternative explanations, things like chance, genetics, faulty memory, fraud, cultural shaping, and even other paranormal ideas like possession or maternal impressions, presenting detailed arguments and evidence from the cases against these alternatives, serving as complete explanations for the whole pattern.
But the sources are also clear, and Stevenson himself was clear, that while the cumulative evidence is presented as highly anomalous and very suggestive, the interpretation remains complex. It's not offered as simple, undeniable proof that's going to convince everyone overnight. It requires careful, open-minded consideration of the data presented.
Definitely. The strength lies, as is presented in the sources, in the consistency and the specificity of those physical correspondences, especially when combined with the behavioral and memory correlates across literally hundreds of cases documented using a consistent methodology over decades. That pattern makes it challenging, they argue, to dismiss the phenomenon as purely random or easily explained away by conventional factors alone.
It certainly presents a profound challenge, at the very least, to a purely materialist view of consciousness and personal identity, which leaves us with this to consider, really. Is specific physical marks on a newborn, present from the very start of life, can genuinely correspond in location, shape, and even forensic detail to injuries suffered by a person who died before that child was born, if a birth defect mirrors a fatal wound or a birthmark aligns with a surgical scar? What then is being transferred? What does this imply about the persistence of something, be it memory, identity, information, maybe a psychic template, beyond the physical body we inhabit in this life? And how might our fundamental scientific understanding of biology, of consciousness, and of what it means to be an individual? How might that need to radically shift if such connections are further substantiated through continued, rigorous, independent research? It's a truly thought-provoking set of correlations presented in these sources.
It certainly gives you something deep to think about. Until our next deep dive.